Professor, let's start with your most recent book. And the title is You and Your Profile, and it's co-written by a fellow philosopher and cultural critic, isn't it? Now, if I understand the basic idea of your book, there is not a distinction between you and your profile. As far as the outside world is concerned, in the age of social media and LinkedIn job resume, you are your profile, isn't it? There's no difference.
Well, that's right. That's one of the that's now I that's the main thesis of the book. The main form in which we develop an identity and achieve having an identity, achieve being recognized through the profile that we create, and that is then validated publicly. So yes, that's one way of how we achieve an identity, right? The idea is that it's not the only way, though. We operate with three different concepts: sincerity, authenticity, and profilicity. And we argue that all these three are identity technologies. They represent different ways in which we shape an identity and in which we can successfully communicate an identity and, so to speak, become ourselves. And sincerity is a traditional form of identity formation, which is functions in orientation to social roles. I mean, specifically in Asian context, that is still something that is very common: family roles, but also professional roles and so forth. And by sincerely committing to such roles, we can successfully become who we are. And then authenticity is something that was developed in modernity, and that represents a decisive shift away from sincerity, because identification through social roles is then perceived as something like conformity, as something that's not really good. And now, kind of under conditions of authenticity, the idea is that you have to be really oriented towards your inner self. It's kind of an individualism, right? And that by finding who you are or developing who you are, that's the way how you truly shape an identity. This age of authenticity, as the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor named it, is coming to an end right now. And that instead of operating with roles or orienting ourselves to this kind of unique, original inner self, instead of this pursuit of originality, we now shape profiles. We create profiles and we project them. And then through social validation feedback loops, these profiles become validated, and then we can become truly invested in them. And in this way, we become our profiles.
You also think there's a connection between self-profiling and identity politics with the current idea about wokeness or woke politics or social justice, the social justice movement. Can you explain what the relationship is?
Well, I regard wokeness basically as a civil religious phenomenon of today, right? I see like the current culture wars between, let's say, wokeism and anti-wokeism as a kind of civil religious schism that we are going through. So I'm not the only person who thinks about wokeism in terms of a civil religion. Other people have said that as well. And just like traditional religions, we're closely tied to sincerity, right? You sincerely commit to a certain religion, be it an Asian religion or a Western religion. Religion also was kind of applying sincerity very strongly, a means of devotion to certain roles and beliefs, for instance. And now what we see, like with wokeism, is an anti-wokeism, that they operate basically in the framework under the conditions of profilicity. So there's a lot of profile shaping going on, whatever we speak about virtue signaling in this context, right? So you commit to certain positions, or rather you display certain attitudes, and this has an extremely strong effect on your profile building. And in this way, I like to add, this is not just merely false, right? In this way, like in the old days with sincerity, you would cultivate a sincere commitment to certain beliefs. And now I think what you do is we create a kind of a true investment into our profile. So people very strongly identify with the virtues they signal. So in this sense, wokeism as well as anti-wokeism, I look at whatever Jordan Peterson as a figure representing
Yes.
anti-wokeism, and they offer very strong profile opportunities, right? Both wokeism and anti-wokeism via you shape a profile by identifying yourself through public display and social validation feedback loops within, for instance, a woke or an anti-woke peer sphere.
Right. Now I live in Canada, North America, and you're from Germany, but now
Right.
working in Macau, and I can see what you are talking about applies, almost 100% to what I see around in Canada, in Toronto, any big cities in North America. But what about non-Western societies, say like China, Macau, Hong Kong? Do you think see similar phenomena actually occurring as well?
Very much so. The conflicts in the West are more between authenticity and profilicity. So that's a constant conflict. People somehow notice that there's a lack of authenticity in profile building. So, which is only natural because it's not authentic. In China, the conflict, I guess, and in Asia in general is more between, because it's not that strongly authenticity focused, is more between sincerity and profilicity. So in this sense, profilicity, rather than seeming inauthentic, may look insincere. So that's here more perceived as the problem. But I mean, I was also thinking with this question, going back, because it has to do with wokeism. So I regard wokeism as a civil religion. So in that sense, it's a kind of a successor of Christianity. And if you look at the previous, let's say, imperialism, colonialist period, right, where the West came to non-Western regions, and then Christianity was kind of the religious adornment that accompanied that, and people were offered the opportunity to become Christians. So look at Hong Kong, for instance, right? Whereas now, in the conflict between the West and the non-West, and I think also in the conflict between North America and Europe on the one side, and Asia and regions China like Hong Kong on the other side, wokeism plays a similar role. And just as in the past, Christianity provided, so to speak, identification opportunities for non-Westerners, now it's wokeism. If you look at the conflict in Hong Kong and so forth, there were also strong kind of woke elements to it, next to many other elements. But nevertheless, yes, I think that also in these non-Western regions, including China, including Hong Kong, wokeism plays an important role in, just as previously Christianity, in not just providing some sort of political frameworks that people can adopt, but on a deeper level, on a more existential level, also offering a certain new form of identity technology. So in a sense, we also see here similar conflicts playing out. Just again, not so much, for instance, in Hong Kong, perhaps, not so much between authenticity and profilicity, but between profilicity on the one hand, which can be woke, can also be anti-woke, and traditional sincerity expectations on the other hand.
We've been talking mostly about domestic politics, but you bring in sort of an international element to it. And what I find interesting is that this, what you call wokeness, or what people call wokeness, is now a kind of could be weaponized by, say, some Western societies to criticize other non-Western societies. What I found particularly interesting is that the U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris just went on a week-long trip to Africa, and before she left, she already started some controversy because she criticized, I think, a new. Some new laws about gay and lesbians, which is fairly draconian. So that already started, and even before she landed, the lawmakers in Ghana were already, criticizing back. So in a way, it's one of those things like human rights or the needs to protect such issues. Social justice could also be weaponized in international politics, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I mean that's what I basically tried to point out earlier. That in this sense, wokeism has replaced the function of Christianity in these endeavors. That it offers not just, a certain civil, religious, or moral framework that people can simply like, but via this also on a deeper level offers some form of cool profile, right? That is very attractive. And to everyone. But so on the one hand, I think that's true. On the other hand, I think we also need to take into account that we have the anti-woke profile. If we look at the conflict, for instance, in Ukraine, at the war there, and I think the Russian side, as far as I can tell, also likes to kind of frame itself as a kind of anti-woke bastion, right? So it works both ways. So we see basically that this kind of civil religious schism between wokeism and anti-wokeism, again, is not because it's similar to whatever, like Protestantism and Catholicism in the past, and they fought wars, even though the basic faith wasn't that different. And yet, these two options offered very different forms of existential, very strong identification options, and allowed for a very strong sense of identity formation. And I think, again, like both wokeism and anti-wokeism are utilized not only in the West as very strong kind of profile offerings that via identification with wokeism or non-wokeism, you can shape and communicate and display a very strong sense of identity. And that doesn't only happen in the West, it also happens in international conflicts. So it's projected on these conflicts. And you see conflicts, whatever, as I mentioned, in Hong Kong or now in Ukraine, they kind of allow for identification, not in the traditional sense of traditional religions. They're no longer actual religious wars, right? And they're also no longer like in the Cold War, ideological wars. They are now basically, in a sense, profile wars.
Thank you so much for your time and insight. I'm sure there's a lot of thoughts for us to digest. And so thank you for joining us, Professor
Thank you
Mark.
very much for having me. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.